Welcome to This Constitution. My name is Savannah Eccles Johnston, and we are joined today by a very special guest, Professor James Caesar, who's a Byrd Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia, received his PhD in political science from Harvard University, and is the author of many books and articles on American political thought and the American founding. And also, I have to say, one of the single best political scientists of his generation. We were very lucky to have him today. Welcome, James. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So today we are going to discuss the presidential selection process, which you wrote a book on, all the way back in 1979. But first, I would like to give an overview of the development of this process for our listeners who might not have any idea what it was originally intended to be like. So can you first tell me, what was the original intent for the presidential selection process by the framers? What were they trying to avoid?
Yes. Well, of course, people overlook the fact that it's like one of the four institutions outlined in the Constitution. They skip over it, probably because it's subsequent fate of the constitutional character of the presidential selection process. But it is one of the four sketched national institutions. So I think that's an important point. Now, what they were trying to get rid of or avoid is interesting today, because one of the things they talk about is fear of intervention by foreign powers in the presidential selection process and the effect that the foreign governments could have on choosing the president of the United States. And of course, it's been a big thing since 2016, when everyone was accusing the Russians of making Putin a deal with Trump, and so on and so forth. I think it's even going on this year. These accusations are being made. I think Iran is involved and a few other foreign powers. So that was one thing that they saw in advance. The other things, some of the other things that they were concerned about, is the things that you would expect, that this system, the system of choosing a president in general, could lead to disorder, demagoguery, and they were always concerned about. So that was another point, that it would be a system that was faulty. Well, those were, I think, the two major concerns that they had in setting up this system.
Those feel very relevant to 2024. But first, political parties really throw chaos in the original system. They didn't see political parties coming. And so almost immediately, that original system breaks down and we move to King Caucus. Can you briefly explain, what is King Caucus? Why did it break down?
That is true. And when you look at the early system, you mentioned the animus against parties was widely felt. There was no desire in the United States at all for political parties one way or another. And Washington spoke ill of them. No one expected parties to emerge. So all this, what we've had, has taken place subsequent to the founding in America. So that, I think, is an important point to start with. But of course, we did eventually develop parties, probably in the latter part of Washington's first term, and in the second term, there was a real division, you could say, between Washington's and the Federalist Party on one hand, and then the Republican Democrats under Jefferson on the other hand, and under Adams. So the country really saw itself as having two parties. If you want to say that the Jefferson Party goes all the way back to that period, you could say it's the oldest party in the world. Now, the question that they had was how they're going to pick, once you have a party, by definition, almost have a nominee, who they were going to pick. It was pretty obvious that Jefferson was the head of the Jefferson Party. After all, it bears his name, but that came afterwards. But that was an important element in the beginning of this. But they had to come up with a nominee, and this was true of both parties. Well, where do you get people together to make this choice at that point? I mean, a national convention was out of the question, coming up with something like that. The idea they came up with, well, we've got a few people here in Washington that could fill the job, namely all the people that were elected to a federal office from both of the two political parties. So the people who were elected to the House or the Senate in the Federalist Party, House and the Senate in the Republican Democratic Party, they were in Washington. Someone came up with the idea, that's a good group to serve as someone who can nominate the candidate for president from our party. What group would be better? In fact, we might think of that in our time. I'm not so sure with the current Congress we would want to do that, but that was the idea. So they quickly put them together, and it was a caucus of those, acting not in their official capacity as senators or representatives, but as people around of high distinction who could make the choice for the party.
But it breaks down. It doesn't last particularly long. Why does what they will later call King Caucus, kind of derisively, why will it break down?
Well, it broke down because the Federalist Party suffered a huge decline in popularity by the end of the Jefferson's administration. The real reason it broke down was because the Federalist parties pretty much ceased to exist outside of New England and had a bad reputation nationally, and it became clear that there would only be one party. So that's why it broke down, not because the system failed and not because the caucus wasn't king, but that's the main reason. So initially we had a system where we really had, in fact, one party in existence, and there was no need for the Federalists to meet. Madison became president, was well-liked enough, and so things continued.
So but this doesn't last. You mentioned that national party conventions were out of the question, but then they become the norm for a huge phase in American politics. You have national party conventions where the selection process is really controlled by political parties. Can you explain how that worked? It sounds kind of nice.
With the decline of the Federalist Party, then people began asking the question when Monroe became president, we don't really have an opponent who we're running against. So in effect, we have what looks like one party again, or no parties. Either way you look at it, one party and no party are the same thing. So the Federalist Party was, you could say, forgotten. And that gave rise then to this idea of the air of good feelings in Monroe's administration. And that didn't mean getting up early in the morning and doing your exercises. The air of good feelings was something quite different. It was a regime that went back to what Washington wanted, namely the selection of the president on the basis of the merits of the individual, not the party. And there was a lot from all quarters, a lot of support for this idea of having a selection system that was in line with the original intent, let's say, in the Constitution, or many of individuals running for the presidency, not political parties.
That's interesting that you say that. That's the original intent, is selecting a person based on merit and not based on party. But that has been so rare in American political history, largely because somehow the founders missed this massive feature in American politics, which is political parties. They didn't see that one coming. So you have just this brief spurt, this era of good feelings, but then you do move back to parties controlling the presidential selection process with Jackson. So that breaks up fairly quickly.
Fairly quickly. It goes on for a while. And when you look at that period there in the 1820s when this was being discussed, you see how widespread at this point, let's say in the 1820s, was the support for individual merit. After all, it makes sense when you read the Federalist Papers and those sections on the presidency. Why shouldn't the president be chosen on the basis of individual merit? It ran through the whole system. The vice president in the original system was not chosen on the basis that the president chose him. It was selected on the basis that this person would run on his own on the basis of his merit. Somewhat like in first grade, or at least I remember when I was at school, and we elected class officers. The president was number one, and number two was the vice president, but not because the president chose him, but because he was number two. So this was the view. There was widespread support for this in that period. So there are lots of reasons why what came underway was a competition between two parties, because it wasn't evident for a good deal of time that we would have two parties.
Right. And you call this brief interlude between 1824 and 1828 the period of nonpartisan self-selection. But it dies after 1828. Once again, we get away from the original intention of picking someone based on merit and instead go to parties. So national party conventions. How does this system work? Because this is quite interesting. Political parties are basically private institutions, and they are selecting the candidates for the most important position in this country. How did that operate?
Well, what brought that into being was the advent of two parties. Just as in the first situation, no one expected this difference between Washington and say, the Jefferson Party. They went in very different directions, very different ways of looking at things. And over a period of time, that led to a split between the two parties. So in this period, let's say after Monroe's president and then the elections of 1828 and everything, people looked at it. This was one reason that we would have two parties, because there were two different points of view. In particular, as you get to 1832, questions of finance were very important. But before that, and this is, I think, the extraordinary thing about the advent of the second political parties, you had an individual, Senator Martin Van Buren from the state of New York, who saw the need for two parties. We needed two parties, not because we had two different points of view. We didn't emphasize that one way or another. That was not the point. We needed two parties to improve the system of presidential selection. So Van Buren did it from the standpoint of improving the institutional framework of American politics. What was the problem, according to Van Buren? He saw in the first or second election without political parties, he saw that lots of candidates for the presidency simply said, well, I want to become president. Well, why not? I'm as good as the guy next to me. We're all from the same party. There's no problem. I want to run. Others want to run. So 5 or 6 people decided they were going to run for president of the United States and to present their candidacy to the American public. So this raised problem, according to Van Buren. One, it raised problems that probably under this system, no one would get a majority. And the consequence of that would be that instead of the electoral system choosing the president, it would have to be chosen in the House. And no one really liked that idea. That was we could talk about that system, very difficult system. And no one really was up for that. So that was one reason. But the other reason, I think the main reason, is that these candidates began campaigning for the presidency way before the election for the presidency. They began competing for the office, and they came from different sections of the country. So the idea was that the effect of this nominating process was to split the country into different groups where people would appeal to their own section against the other sections, that North would be against South, would be against West. And instead of bringing the country together, it would lead to separation and animus of the different parties. So the idea of unifying as an aspect of the presidential election, that it was a time to bring the country together, fell apart completely. And this, Van Buren said, was a very, very dangerous system. So he and a fellow from Richmond got together and we said, is this really a good idea? Don't we have to change the system? And I think that was probably the key point, moving in that direction. So Van Buren then moved to persuade Jackson slowly that this idea of having parties was a good idea, not for the point of view necessarily of what you agree or disagree with, but for the idea of fixing the system. So when the difference broke out on financial matters and banks in 1832, Van Buren went to Jackson and he says, if you want to win presidency for the next time, I'll bring you the Democratic Party, which is all my friends in Congress. I'll bring that support so you really will win, have no problems, and you'll also do something good for the country. And so at that point, Jackson began to turn towards Van Buren's point of view and to develop a two-party system for the purpose of parties, somewhat like Edmund Burke in England, that there was something to be said for this competition.
Okay, this is such an interesting point. The idea that not only were political parties inevitable because people disagree, but that they're actually healthy for the American political system. They performed an important function. And also that the original intention for the system failed not just because political parties came out of nowhere, surprise, but also because the original system didn't work. It didn't function, maybe theoretically fine, but in practice, Van Buren is saying it doesn't work. So you actually have to move to a different system, a party-dominated system to improve the selection process.
It doesn't work well, yeah, because it goes to the House. And as I said, that was a very difficult position and led to conflict and dissatisfaction among the American people. So don't we need another system, as you say? That was I think the key point. And it makes this unknown person, Martin Van Buren, otherwise known maybe for the fact that this word we use, which is the second most used word in the English language. The most word is like. You walk through a campus and you hear it's like this, it's like that. No, it was okay. And that was supposedly came from Van Buren when he ran later for president, that in his hometown was Old Kinderhook in New York, and that was the OK clubs. And supposedly, this has never been proven, that became the origin of the word okay. So the next time you okay something, you should do so with great respect.
I kind of feel bad for Martin Van Buren. No one talks about him. I certainly don't speak about him very often in class, and yet he's so important. So thank you, Martin Van Buren. Well, an interesting, again, theme here, though, is that this evolution of the presidential selection process away from kind of original intent was actually an improvement, that it's not necessarily a bad thing that the country moved away.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Van Buren had personal reasons as well. We can talk about the reasons from the point of view of the country was important, but Van Buren had the point of view that up to this point in American politics, all the people who had been presidents were either sons of, or related to the founders, or famous like Jackson himself. And yet now was the time when that generation was past. And Van Buren wanted to provide different grounds for becoming president in the new America to come, namely that you were a good politician. You didn't have to be a superstar or the son of a superstar or the wife, in case of Michelle, of a superstar. You didn't have to be that. You had to show that you could rise in American politics through being an effective politician and bring different capabilities to the office of higher office in the United States. And I think that was an important point as well. And afterwards, of course, you begin to get people of that form as president of the United States. And no one's asking, was your father a president? And before that, something in the Revolutionary War or founder or whatever words they were using to sanctify that first generation.
Right. So they prevent this kind of installation of an American aristocracy. In a way,
yes, I'd say that would be a good way of putting it. Not all of them really deserved the title of an aristocrat, but I suppose you could say that was important. But look at the quality of people that you had as the first presidents. It's amazing. In Washington, I don't think there's a better person, better statesman the world has ever had than Washington. And then you have Jefferson and Adams. Well, Adams and both of them were towering intellects. And Jefferson is sort of a genius. Adams, a great scholar. Madison, one of the smartest people. He knew the first half, and I think only the first half of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Law is better than any person I know, including everyone in France. His commentaries on those are excellent. Monroe, well, maybe. He lived right around Charlottesville, so that was enough. He could at least touch the glory of Jefferson and so forth. And then Jackson was a hero of sorts. People have different views on Jackson, but everyone knew who he was. So it was the idea of elevating someone to the president who was not well known because of something he had done before. And that's, after all, where we're becoming in the United States. The presidents after that are people known more or less, but not great figures.
So between 1832 all the way up until 1912, we use Martin Van Buren's system. We use the National Party convention system. And when people think about the system, they think of smoky back rooms. They think of party elites picking the candidate that they think is most capable of winning the next election. What goes wrong? What happens to Martin Van Buren's system? How do we slowly begin to move to this more plebiscitary system?
Yeah. Oh, you mean the one that comes later?
Yes.
After. Now, first, we should say a thing about that system itself.
Oh, please, yes.
Not much, but in a way, it proved that politicians could nominate the next president. And there was a certain safety in that arrangement. So, in a way, people felt that by using this system, you had good people who were making the choice, or at least responsible people, by the convention system. And as it turned out in that system, the ones who were really running it, to a large extent, were people who had capacities to do so. It was like having, I wouldn't use an aristocratic group from that, but good politicians. Wouldn't you want, you could say in the abstract, mayors, governors, politicians, having a big say in the nomination of the next president. Didn't that really make sense? Weren't they in some ways like the electors were supposed to be, people competent to make a choice? And that, I think, was the hope. They made the choice. And these people were able to choose not only themselves as electors, but all the people in the states that were working for parties, because parties now became more and more important. But working for them, I mean, they were chosen by a system in which they were given jobs to work for the government because they supported a party. I mean, and the ones who appointed them obviously were getting something for appointing them. You're doing this because there is a Republican and a Democratic way of delivering the mail. And the way to do it is you deliver it for my party. And they hired these people to do all these jobs in American politics. And that was thought to be a safe way of choosing the nominees. So that I would say is one of the main things about it. But the opposite, the problem of that system, which I said had something to say for it, was corruption. People were chosen and given jobs because they worked for the party. And they helped out the political party by doing the work of the party, meaning helping in elections to nominate other people from the party or to win elections at the state level. And the idea of politics is to win. So that was an important advantage for these on both sides. Both parties struggled to secure this advantage. So I think there was a lot to be said for the system, but it did have the problem of corruption.
And that's why the progressives come after it.
The progressives come after it because they're progressive, to tell you the truth. Namely, that they thought that everything in the future is going to bring greater progress than we've seen in the past. And of course, the ones who were going to bring this to the country were the ones who understood progress, and that, by accident, just happened to be the progressives. So this idea of progressivism, let's say, goes all the way back to Jefferson in the United States and to the French at that time, Condorcet and Turgot. Turgot, you could say, invented the idea of progress. He looked at it and he said, don't give me the idea that we're always doing the same thing. The inevitability of history is that each generation will know more than the last generation, and understand that stage after stage after stage is going to bring us greater progress in all realms, not just in the technical and scientific realms, which was just getting started, but in the moral realms as well. This became the way of thinking and actually took over how America thought in many respects. You know, like our historian Bancroft and others, and the idea of the American destiny, that this was all going to come about because this was progress. And the nation that embodied progress was none other than the United States of America. This, you could say, I'm getting a little off the subject here, but I'll say it anyhow. But Hegel, in his book, on history and whatnot, he indicates by saying the next stage is going to be some new stage in history, stage after stage after stage in history. And the next stage would be in the New World, and it would be something like democracy or something like that. And that's the theme of all of Bancroft's writing, that in a way, this is the spot, this is the nation that's been given the task of progress to the world to come. And this is the nation that's going to lead that crusade. And that was Bancroft and his student, more or less, O'Sullivan, who came up with the idea of manifest destiny.
So, but let's give the progressives just a little bit of credit here. There actually was an immense amount of corruption in the party system by the early 1900s. So they are reacting against something that is deeply felt in the population. And so they proposed primaries as a way to go over the heads of the national parties to allow the people to have some greater selection in this most important office. But it's only a mixed system for the next 50 or so years. How does that even operate? How do you have primaries next to national party conventions, but primaries aren't actually that powerful yet? Can you explain to me how that worked between 1912 and 1968?
Wilson actually proposed in one speech the idea of a national primary. Well, he's ahead of his time, things like that. But in a way, it was logical that the progressives were also, or said they were very democratic. Whether they were or they not, I doubt it. sometimes, depending on the day. But so this was the logical next step. If you want, in a way, the people to govern, what's more important than nominating the candidates who would be president? Because he who nominates controls. Parties who you'd put on top is the important thing. Why shouldn't it go to to those who are sovereign? That was the thinking, as well as to eliminate corruption, as you say. But this idea is to turn it over to the people who should be governing the United States, which is the people. So that was what they selected as their desired goal, and so they started moving. Now they proposed this. It was also being proposed at other levels, not just the presidency, but it already had started at levels of lower offices in the United States as a sort of democratic move of the next phase of American politics. When it came to the presidency, when they proposed this, they never succeeded in getting a majority of the states. They were right near, but not quite over the point where it was 100% sure. So in a way, you had a balance in the American system for the next many years, which many people have gone back and defended. But the balance was between states which chose their delegates on the basis of primaries, a little bit less than half, and states which chose their delegates on the basis of popular support of which candidates the members of that party from that state preferred. So that was roughly it. And but the progressives, as I said, fell short. And also, in these progressive primaries that were put up, in many of the states, they had the people choosing the delegates, but they didn't put the name of the candidate on the ballot too. So they were a little behind times. In a way, it was both. And you could say that gave the advantages, if you look at it, of both. The progressives had the advantage of being able to choose by popular means and to show something through the primaries who the people wanted. And the old system had this idea of having people who were, in a way, professionals. I use that word not in a deleterious way, but in a way that a proud way, that these were the people who knew something about politics. And shouldn't you have someone who knows something about politics choosing the president of the United States? So the two together were on top for a long time, I would say. So I gave it the name. I think I'll claim one credit for my book, Presidential Second, that it was a mixed system for a long time and had the advantages of a mixed system.
Right. So this odd mixed system, which dies after the 1972 McGovern-Fraser reforms, right? So it's now primaries are king. And that old system is just washed away. This modern system is become characterized by weak parties and by really strong individual personalities. This is so different from the intention at the founding. What are the greatest dangers in this latest phase, in this primary controlled system?
I'd say that the dangers really go back when you look at it now at the nominating stages is what bothered Van Buren, the possibility of demagogic candidates who haven't been sifted through a process which assures that at least they're going to be okay. I know we had a lot of mediocre presidents. I can't remember half their names in the second half of the 19th century. All of them weren't as bad as people think. You know, like Garfield, he was a good guy, and others were more or less mediocre, but they were safe mostly. And that's a real credit that you're not going to be nominating and as a candidate for this high office and now coming up leader of the world, whatever you want to say the United States was. You're not going to come up with someone who's really not fit for the job. And maybe you can trust the people who from the old system, professionals, to at least assure that. That would be, I think, one of the strong arguments. You won't have the great errors as you did in the past. And you go back to the 19th century, you see this case in the conventions. How was the convention formed in a smoke-filled room? I mean, bring together people in a smoke-filled room, not a marijuana room, but a smoke-filled room. You're going to get people who care about the well-being of the nation, or at least not having someone secondary as president. And the whole system was based on that. They didn't campaign in the 19th century for the presidency, those running for president. They maybe let it be known that they might be interested, but they didn't show up at the convention. None of them showed up at the convention unless it was by accident, that they happened to be named before as a speaker at the convention. Otherwise, they didn't show up. They instead sent their seconds to the convention to make contacts with others, to talk with others, to begin to lay a kind of framework for their being president, but not in an open and direct way. So this was satisfactory to the American people throughout this period. And I think it has a lot to say for it.
It's interesting that list that you gave us at the very beginning of what were the founders trying to prevent, what did they fear in the presidential selection system, are many of the dangers inherent in this latest phase, the primary phase of the presidential selection system. So Professor James Caesar is made ruler of the presidential selection system. How do you change this system going forward? Are there any concrete reforms that states should pursue to improve the system? How do you fix this?
I don't think, when you look at things generally, that you can fix things easily by going against the movement of democracy. That's a tough sell. You have to look for other ways. We're used to thinking in democratic terms, to go to the American people and say, let's give the nomination back to the bosses. This doesn't sit well. I mean, everything in ways calibrated towards looking to what the people want. Some people worried about it. Let's say go to 2016 election, which was in a way an election that got a lot of people thinking. I remember after the election, I went to a number of conferences on this. This subject came up among academics of different ilk. Can't we go back to something? All these people who all the time called for more and more democracy in the selection process had militated in favor of this. All of a sudden, they were concerned about the old party and the possible benefits that it once had as against the primaries and democracy of the new system. They were moving in that direction. But I don't think that they had a chance. There were other things that were done a little bit in this direction, actually. The Democrats, for example, a little bit early on, began talking about and instituted this thing called superdelegates. That was, instead of electing all the delegates by primaries, you'd have a considerable number of delegates that would be selected because they were party figures. They didn't have to run for an office, for a delegate. They were selected instead because they had worked for the party. And if they worked for the party, isn't it natural that they should be given a certain prize for that they knew the party, they knew its interests, they had the fate of the party at stake, they continued to build it, where the other people were, may have had a favorite, but they weren't working 100% of the time for parties. They weren't always in line with other people who wanted a change towards the rule of the people, because it suited their interests and the interests of the interest groups for which they worked. That was another character of this later system. It was the people, but also the people working for different interest groups. And I think the media was moving in that direction as well.
So, but you mentioned superdelegates.
Super.
But superdelegates have lost a great deal of power since 2016. They're basically meaningless in the Republican Party, and they are kicked off to only the second round.
Right, but it was something, that's true. A third round maybe. But at least it was a realization on the part of the people earlier than the Trump election that it was a good idea to have some professionals. That was the first time they were willing to stand up since 1787 and say something in favor of something like a responsible decision maker. So I thought that was a nice thing to occur. But as you saw, this time it didn't, they could have some role, but not a significant role.
Right. There was a popular uprising, especially in the Democratic Party, against superdelegates. So as we say, they're much weaker in 2024, which gets to your point that it's so difficult to unravel this system. We seem to have been on this inexorable march towards a popular system, towards a deeply plebiscitary system. And are there any kind of safeguards that can be implemented now? Or is it simply too late? Are we just going to keep moving forward? Superdelegates are not about to get more powerful. They're going to get less powerful with each convention. So what can we do? Is it simply we're moving in that direction? Are there any kind of safeguards that you would say put these in now to try and counter?
I'm not sure that there are, that there's a willingness to do this. The other thing that may have helped when you look back, I don't want to be partisan here in any way. I never am. But the fact that after 2016, which you could say was the high point of a very strange election. I mean, you could say Trump was double what you would fear in the abstract. He hadn't been a Republican before. He had been on the side of every issue you could imagine. He was a millionaire and a movie star with no real important role in politics. How the heck did he become nominated as president of the United States and running against some pretty good people, or so you could say? Cruz, I mean, not a bad person. Little Marco, I'm sorry, Marco Rubio. These were qualified politicians, to say the least, and others were in it too. Why shouldn't they have gotten somewhere? Instead, they got nowhere. And Trump won, you could say, in an outrageous way. I mean, he sensed something about what the American people wanted, but he was able to win this election by simply wiping out these alternatives, making fun of Cruz's father and thing after thing after thing. And of course, afterwards, people look back and they said, well, we had Trump and a lot of people liked him. And they weren't about to make this big issue that we have to get rid of democracy because we had Trump. A lot of people spoke in those terms, especially, as I said, when you went to these conferences, because no one at this conference, I can assure you, was for Trump. That's inconceivable. They were intellectuals of some sort, and therefore, for sure, were against Trump. And they had a lot to say about the character of this, but we've become used to this and to the sort of candidate he is. So that lost movement in favor of anything like the superdelegates, I think, for being those who would select our nominees.
So primaries are here to stay, no matter how much I dislike primaries.
You're saying this, Savannah, on your authority.
No, I'm asking you.
Oh.
Primaries are here to stay. We're not going to roll these back, no matter how much I'd like to. Primaries are here to stay. Has there been some kind of counter movement with the installation, the last minute installation of Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee? She didn't win any primaries. Her selection was purely by the party. Is that kind of a counter movement?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, when you look at why she was there, it was partly luck that she happened to be in that place. I'm not talking about the whole system that brought her there, but people looking at the Democratic Party at this point, I think had come to the conclusion that maybe Biden was a good president. Maybe he had done well. I mean, he thought he was a good president. A lot of people did. It wasn't so bad. But a lot of people thought he was kind of weak as president, and not at the top of the list of popularity. And of course, the other thing which loomed was his age and senescence, which was coming with it. I think this was obvious to almost everyone. Whatever they said, maybe even the New York Times would admit that this was the case with him. So when people looked at it wisely, I think they looked at it and they said, well, maybe he can make it through to the end of this term. He only has a few months to go and avoid a big and difficult time. He can make it through, but certainly he can't make it through the next 4 years. I think that was a unanimous conclusion, unanimous among the Democrats. So the way was, how do we get rid of Obama? Plus, I think they made a calculation that in the case of Biden, that it was going to be a difficult period, and the next term, the person, if the Democrats were to win the next election, would be the vice president, and there was no way that Biden was going to get rid of Harris. I mean, he had chosen her for a certain reason. She was there. I'm not saying she was good. I'm not saying she was bad. She was quiet. So that was going to be the next president anyhow, I think a lot of people thought. So go with her, and maybe she'd turn out better than people thought. Look, let's face it, she hadn't distinguished herself. We look at Harris from the last, say, 2 months. And obviously, she's come up in the status of the American people. She's a pretty good speaker. She did well in the debate against Trump. I think probably you could say she had the better of in that particular exchange. Trump was all right, but he wasn't at his high point. So people have come to like her. And in any case, this has made people a little bit more confident of her, maybe, at least Democrats, of it. She should win. So I don't see this having this effect.
Okay, so this is just a blip. It's not a sign of a push against the primary system. Primaries are here to stay. Buckle up, America. We're stuck with them. So thank you for your time today. I think this has been very useful. I think our listeners will have taken a lot away from the history of the development of the presidential selection process and kind of its gradual and inevitable path to the plebiscitary system that we have and bemoan today.
Well, thank you, Savannah. It's been nice chatting with you.